She poured cold coffee into the cake batter, pressed spent grounds into the pork shoulder, and rang a used tea bag over cast iron without breaking her stride. None of it was written down. None of it needed to be. Here are 30 genius ways Black grandmas used leftover coffee and tea. Red-eye gravy was the reason you never poured out the coffee before breakfast was done. After the country ham crisped in the cast iron, that salty, smoke-cured slab that sweated its fat into the pan, she added the morning's leftover black coffee and scraped every brown bit off the bottom with a wooden spoon. The coffee and drippings swirled into a thin, dark sauce that no flour-thickened gravy could match. Historians trace red-eye gravy back to Southern kitchens of the early 1800s, where it was called poor man's gravy, bird-eye gravy, and bottom sop, all signaling one truth: nothing wasted. The red eye appeared when fat and coffee separated, forming a circle that stared up at you. You poured it over grits and sopped it with a split biscuit. The ratio came from how much coffee was left in the pot and how much ham had cooked, not from any measurement. She knew by the color. Nobody makes it like that anymore, and the reason is simple. Nobody keeps a pot of real coffee sitting all morning waiting to be useful. The richest chocolate cake in the kitchen came from the simplest trick: leftover brewed coffee poured straight into the batter in place of water. Black coffee still in the pot from that morning. No one called it a technique. It was just what you did when the cocoa was cheap and the water made the cake taste flat. The science, which nobody had a name for at the time, was this: the mild acidity in coffee intensifies cocoa's natural bitterness, pulling out flavor compounds that heat alone can't reach. Depression-era bakers stumbled onto this while stretching scarce dairy during the 1930s, discovering that coffee-moistened chocolate cake needed neither eggs nor butter to taste extraordinary. In Black households where the pot went on at dawn and sat until the last cup was claimed, there was always some left over by the time afternoon baking started. She poured until the batter looked right, deep brown, loose enough to drop from the spoon. You could not taste the coffee in the finished cake. You could only taste that it was better than anyone else's. The recipe card said liquid. It meant coffee if you knew. The tea rinse came after the hot comb. She'd brew a strong pot of black tea, not the pale kind, but the kind that turned water the color of old wood, and let it cool on the counter while she finished pressing your hair. When the iron was put away, she poured the cool tea slowly over your scalp and worked it down to the ends. This was a practice tracing to West African beauty traditions, where black tea's high tannin content had long been used to seal the hair cuticle, add shine, and reduce breakage in tightly coiled hair. Tannins in strong brewed black tea bind to protein in the hair shaft, temporarily strengthening it, which is why hair poured over with a tea rinse sat smoother and reflected more light. She didn't know the chemistry. She knew the result. She'd learned it from the woman who pressed her hair, who learned it from the woman before. A pot of tea was never just tea in those kitchens. It was hair care, medicine, the quiet rhythm of a Saturday afternoon that began before you were old enough to hold still. That ritual went with her. Coffee grounds on the meat, spent ones, still damp from the morning pot, was a technique that lived in African American kitchens long before any restaurant put it on a menu. The grounds went on to tougher cuts: pork shoulder, beef chuck, venison from the hunt, pressed into the surface with the heel of the hand 2 or 3 hours before the fire. The acids in permit spent coffee grounds, denature surface proteins, breaking down connective tissue and allowing the interior to cook more evenly, which is why Shirley May's Cafe in Louisville, Kentucky, a storied soul food institution, famously added coffee to their meatloaf. In households where the cheapest cuts were the only cuts, this knowledge was survival arithmetic. No store-bought tenderizer, no extra marinade ingredient, just the grounds that would have gone into the garden or the trash, pressed flat against the meat and left to work. The grounds came off before cooking. The flavor stayed. The cut that came out of that skillet tasted like it had cost twice what it did, and that was the point. Not to impress anyone, but to make sure nobody at this table went without a satisfying meal. And if the meat trick surprised you, wait until you hear what a splash of coffee did to a pot of beans. The pinto beans had been simmering since noon. She lifted the lid, tasted, and reached for the coffee pot. 3 or 4 ounces, poured in and stirred once, lid back down. Coffee added a roasted, slightly bitter undertone that amplified the earthiness of the beans in a way nothing else replicated. You couldn't identify it. You only knew this pot tasted different from every other pot. The distinction mattered in those kitchens. Watching was the only instruction you'd receive. She didn't call you over. She didn't explain. You either saw it or you missed it, and missing it meant your bean pot would always have something absent you couldn't name. This appears in old community cookbooks and in the margins of handwritten recipe cards, but it mostly lived in hands. Those hands are gone. The trick went with them, and the bean pots people make today are nourishing, but they're not the same. Cold sweet tea in the cornbread batter was the solution for mornings when the buttermilk was gone and the store was too far. Not freshly brewed, the leftover pitcher from yesterday, a little flat, a little darker than it started. It went into the batter in the same measure as buttermilk would have. The slight acidity in tea activated the baking soda the same way buttermilk did, giving the bread lift and a faint tang. Households across the rural South regularly substituted tea for buttermilk in quick breads during summer when heat spoiled dairy before it could be used. In African American families where sweet tea was brewed in gallon pitchers daily, particularly through the 1940s and 60s, there was almost always leftover tea before there was leftover buttermilk. The cornbread came out slightly darker in crust, denser in crumb, with a whisper of sweetness nobody could name. She'd smile and say she just had a good hand with the batter. The people who ate it believed her. The ones who watched closely knew better. Coffee grounds went into the garden the same way everything else did, by the rule that nothing useful left this house without being fully spent. Scraped from the morning pot directly into the vegetable patch, worked into the soil around the tomatoes and collards with the toe of a shoe. By the mid-1800s, agricultural publications already documented that spent grounds contained measurable nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, 3 primary nutrients plants need for growth. In Black family gardens throughout the rural South, where commercial fertilizer was expensive and scarce, coffee grounds cycled into the earth as a matter of course. She didn't think of it as science. She thought of it as not throwing away something that still had work to do. Those gardens, dense, productive, year after year, without store-bought amendments, were a form of knowledge that slipped away when the houses were sold. Spent tea bags didn't go in the trash after the pot was poured. They went on the eyelids or pressed against the burn from the stove or lay cool and damp on a child's swollen insect sting. The tannic acid in black tea constricts blood vessels and reduces inflammation when applied to skin, a property documented in medical literature going back to the 19th century. In kitchens where a tube of cream cost money nobody had, this was the first response. The bag had to be cooled but not cold. Body temperature, set on the counter just long enough to be bearable against skin. She'd hold it against the burn for 60 seconds and tell you not to squirm. The swelling went down. You didn't always believe it was the tea. She didn't need you to believe it. She just needed it to work. In households running 2 or 3 tea bags through a full day's worth of steeping, there were always enough used bags on the counter for whatever the kitchen sent at you next. The tea bag as household remedy is mostly gone now, replaced by products that cost 10 times as much and work about as well. Wild game, deer, rabbit, squirrel, had a strength of flavor that grocery store meat never had, and the kitchen method for drawing it back toward edible was an overnight coffee marinade. She'd brew a pot strong and dark, let it cool, and submerge the cleaned and cut meat in it overnight in a covered bowl in the icebox. By morning, the acid in the coffee had begun to break down the gamey proteins in the surface tissue, and the roasted notes of the brew had woven into the outer layer so subtly they'd cook off, leaving only a cleaner, deeper savoriness behind. Venison in particular, which many black families in rural communities relied on through the 1940s and 50s as primary winter protein, responded well to this treatment. The coffee brought the wild meat closer to what a store cut tasted like without eliminating the richness that made it worth eating. This was the alchemy of the hunter's kitchen, taking what the land gave and persuading it into something the whole table would eat without complaint. She always knew it had worked when they asked for more without asking what was in it. Collard greens that had dried out in the refrigerator, or mustard greens cut a day too long, had a toughness that extra cooking couldn't fix. The solution was a soak in strong brewed black tea before the greens went into the pot. Cold tea, enough to cover the leaves for 20 to 30 minutes. The tannins in black tea soften the cell walls of leafy greens by drawing out excess mineral salts that cause stiffness, loosely parallel to how tannins tenderize meat protein. The greens came out darker and more pliable, and they took to the potlikker faster once they hit the cast iron. This was not a trick anyone announced. If the greens were on the stove, someone had already done the work before you arrived. You saw the bowl. You didn't comment. You filed it away. In those kitchens, knowledge passed through watching. The moment you had to ask, you'd already missed the lesson. Pound cake was her signature, and the secret lived in the batter before the loaf ever reached the oven. A spoonful of strong, cold brewed coffee stirred in after the butter and sugar creamed together. Not enough to taste, enough to deepen. Coffee worked on vanilla and butter the way it worked on chocolate, amplifying existing flavor compounds without introducing a new one, the way a pinch of salt sharpens sweetness without tasting salty. Pound cake was the church cake, the repast cake, the birthday and graduation cake, the one that appeared at every table of consequence in African American households from the 1940s through the 70s. Edna Lewis, who spent decades documenting the foodways of Freetown, Virginia, wrote of pound cakes made with exacting, unhurried attention. The coffee edition was not in published recipes, it lived in the hands. And women who understood that certain flavors needed a bridge, not a spotlight. She is gone. You can follow her recipe exactly, and the cake will never be quite what it was. Dark wood furniture, the dining table, the sideboard, the chest that came up from the south on the back of a truck went dull without care, and the care didn't require a product from the store. Cold coffee and a clean rag. She dipped the corner into the leftover pot, wrung it nearly dry, and rubbed along the grain in slow, even strokes. The coffee's tannins temporarily restored color to the wood surface, darkened the nicks to match the surrounding grain, and left a faint protective sheen. Household management guides as far back as the 1800s listed cold coffee as a practical material for conditioning dark wood surfaces. In rented rooms and later in owned homes where the furniture represented years of saving, this was simply maintenance. You treated what you had as if it would last because you needed it to. The table lasted. The knowledge of how to keep it did not. Weak sweet tea was the medicine that lived in the kitchen before medicine was something you bought. When a child came down with a stomach ailment, the cramping, the nausea, the refusal to eat, she brew a pot of black tea to half strength, sweeten it with a small spoon of sugar, and press the warm cup into small hands. Sit, drink all of it. The tannic acid in black tea has been confirmed by modern research to have anti-diarrheal properties, binding to intestinal proteins and slowing transit, a finding that validated what these kitchens had practiced for generations without a clinical word for it. In African American households throughout the rural South and later in northern cities, weak sweet tea was the first line of response for sick young ones, particularly through the 1930s and 40s when doctor visits cost money families didn't have. The dosage was never written anywhere. It lived in the reading of symptoms, how pale they looked, whether they could keep water down. She knew. The women who came after her learned to reach for the phone instead of the pot. The pot worked. An open jar of dried coffee grounds on the icebox shelf. That was the trick for a refrigerator that had started smelling like everything stored inside it at once. Not baking soda, not a product from the store. Just the grounds from this morning's pot, spread thin in a shallow dish and set where the air could move around them. Coffee grounds are porous and nitrogen rich, meaning they absorb volatile organic compounds, the gases that give old food its smell rather than masking them. The grounds went into the garden after a few days, swapped out for a fresh batch from the pot. Nothing wasted twice. She changed them without ceremony, the whole system costing nothing because it ran on what the kitchen already produced. Every byproduct in those kitchens had a next use, and the next use had a use after that. But the coffee wasn't the only thing protecting what she cooked in. Brewed tea, the last cold inch left in the pot at the end of the day, went into the cast iron itself. Not to cook, just poured in, swirled around, then wiped dry before the pan was hung. The tannins in brewed black tea react with the iron in the pan's surface, forming a mild mineral bond that resists moisture and slows the oxidation that causes rust between uses. In households where cast iron was an inheritance, the skillet seasoned over decades until smooth as glass. This step was automatic. You saw her do it, you did it, and your skillet lasted longer than anyone who didn't know. The practice appeared in household guides from the 1800s alongside coffee grounds for garden use and tea leaves for carpet sweeping. The full economy of a kitchen that wasted nothing. Cast iron, maintained this way, needed no special product, just the last of the tea and a dry cloth. Nobody told you the gravy had coffee in it. That was the point. A teaspoon, sometimes less, sometimes a tablespoon, when the pan drippings were pale and the gravy needed color, stirred in at the end after the flour had browned in the fat and the liquid had gone in and thickened. The coffee disappeared completely into the savory darkness of the sauce. What it left behind was depth, a roasted undertone that made the gravy taste like it had cooked all day when it had cooked for 12 minutes, a color so rich and brown that nobody asked whether there was enough in the pan. In Louisiana, this technique merged with the red-eye gravy tradition, black coffee deglazing cast iron after country ham, but it traveled north with the Great Migration and settled into urban kitchens as a general brown gravy trick. She used it on pork gravy, chicken gravy, the pan sauce from a roast. The coffee never announced itself. People just said the gravy was good, especially good, better than anyone else's, and she'd nod and say thank you and tell you nothing. The night before the beans cooked, the beans soaked. Everybody knew that part. What not everybody knew was what went into the soaking water, along with the cold water and the dried beans. A quarter cup of leftover coffee from the morning pot poured in before the bowl went into the icebox. By morning, the coffee had worked on the outer layer of the beans, the pectin-rich seed coat that, when softened slowly, allowed the beans to cook more evenly and absorb seasoning more deeply. This was the kind of detail that separated a good cook from a great one, and it was never written in any recipe because it wasn't a recipe. It was a practice, a habit of the hands. She did it without thinking, the way you brush your teeth without deciding to. The beans always came out better at her house. Now you know why? She could tell you hadn't cleaned those windows in weeks. She didn't say it out loud. She just went to the counter, picked up the cold tea from the pot that had been sitting since morning, soaked the corner of a cloth, and started on the glass. Cold brewed black tea cut grease from glass surfaces because the tannins acted as a mild solvent against the oily film that cooking vapor left on windows and mirrors near the stove. The result was streak-free, and the faint smell that lingered was a good deal more welcome than the chemical bite of commercial glass cleaner. This was a technique documented in Victorian household guides, which listed cold tea as a standard window treatment alongside bicarbonate of soda for deodorizing and vinegar for cutting limescale. She knew none of that history. She just knew what her mother had done, and her mother before that, and that the windows looked right when she was finished. If you had store-bought cleaner under the sink that you'd spent money on, she would not touch it. She had her way. You learned eventually that her way worked better. Once the coffee cooled, some of it didn't go back for a second cup or into the cake batter or onto the meat. Some of it went over her head. She'd tilt forward at the sink and pour the cooled, strong brewed coffee slowly through her hair, root to tip, catching it in a bowl and pouring it through again, 2 or 3 passes. For dark hair beginning to show gray, or for hair that had faded from pressing in sun, the coffee acted as a temporary tint, darkening the hair shaft along the same mechanism as a black tea rinse, but with more depth. Coffee contains melanoidins, complex browning compounds formed during the roasting process that temporarily coat the hair cuticle and restore color. The effect lasted through the next washing. It wasn't a cure for gray, and she wasn't trying to hide anything. It was maintenance, the same as everything else in those kitchens, keeping what you had in the best shape you could, manage with what was already on hand before moving on to the next thing. Long before she was pouring coffee through her hair, there were households where coffee itself was something you made from what you had, because real coffee cost what most families couldn't spend. Roasted okra seeds brewed as a coffee substitute had been documented as far back as the Civil War, when the Union naval blockade cut off Southern imports and families turned to their gardens. A 1863 issue of the Southern Banner out of Athens, Georgia, ran detailed instructions. Parch the okra seeds over a good fire, stirring until dark brown, then brew as you would coffee. In African American communities where okra was already a garden staple, grown for its pods, for its West African culinary roots, the seeds that would otherwise be discarded became the morning pot. The drink was nuttier than grain substitutes and close enough that households using it didn't always say what was in the cup. It cost nothing that wasn't already growing. Spent coffee grounds mixed with a small amount of lard or rendered fat made a hand scrub that no dollar store product could improve on. The grounds were coarse enough to work as an abrasive against the calloused skin on knuckles and palms, the kind of rough skin that came from wringing out laundry, scrubbing floors, and working gardens without gloves, and the oils in the fat moisturized what the abrasion had opened up. Women who spent their days in kitchens and in other people's houses doing domestic work came home with hands that looked like they had lived harder than the rest of them. And this was the routine that kept those hands from cracking and splitting through the dry months. The grounds were already on the counter. The lard was already in the can on the stove. You mixed a small amount in your palm, worked it in circles over both hands for a minute, rinsed in warm water. The hands came up softer then. They started. No bottle, no label, no instruction. Just two things from the kitchen, doing the work they were suited for. When the black dress had faded to muddy charcoal or the dark trousers had gone gray at the knees, she brewed a pot of tea strong enough to stain the counter if it splashed. The garment went into the sink, the tea went over it, and it soaked until the water cooled. Strong brewed black tea contains tannins and dark pigment compounds that temporarily bond to natural fabric fibers, restoring depth to faded, dark colors without the expense of commercial dye. In households where the church outfit had to last through another season and the fabric store was a luxury, this was how you kept what you had looking like something. She'd hang the garment to dry in the shade. Sun would fade it back faster, then press it while still slightly damp. Sunday morning, it looked close to new. Nobody needed to know that spent the night in a pot of tea. Time equals 1 second / greater than a splash of coffee in the morning cornmeal. Mush was the kind of thing you didn't think about until she was gone, and the mush tasted wrong, and you couldn't figure out why. She made it for the adults, the thick, slow-cooked mush that could hold you through a morning of hard work. When it had thickened in the pot, she'd pour in what was left in the coffee cup, maybe a quarter cup, maybe a little more, and stir it in. The coffee deepened the flavor of the coarse grain the way it deepened everything else it touched, pulling out roasted notes and adding a bitterness that cut through the fat and made the bowl taste more substantial than its ingredients had any right to. Through the 1940s and 50s, when cornmeal was a primary morning staple in black households across the South and the northern cities of the Great Migration, this trick stretched both the corn and the coffee into something more than either was alone. She isn't here to make it now. You can make it yourself. It won't be the same. Strong brewed black tea went into the brine the night before the pork went into the pot. Not a complicated brine, salt, water, sometimes a little sugar, but the tea was the part nobody wrote on the recipe card because everyone in the kitchen already knew it was supposed to be there. The tannins in black tea react with the proteins in pork and poultry the way a salt brine does, drawing moisture in and holding it during cooking, which is why tea brine pork came out juicier than meat soaked in plain salt water. This practice moved through the African diaspora into Southern cooking, where tea was plentiful and cheaper than the cuts it improved. The pork didn't taste of tea, it tasted of itself, but better. People asked for more and couldn't say why. She knew why. She wasn't telling. What she kept to herself in the kitchen, she shared without ceremony on the stoop. Dried coffee grounds, the spent ones, still slightly damp and smelling of morning, scattered along the base of the front steps and across the threshold where the ants came in. No insecticide, no call to the landlord, just the grounds from the pot broadcast thin along the edges where the floor met the wall, along the windowsills, around the pipes under the sink. The caffeine and acids remaining in spent coffee grounds are toxic to soft-bodied insects. Ants, slugs, and certain beetles avoid grounds-treated surfaces consistently enough that modern pest management literature acknowledges the practice. In households where spending money on pest control was not an option, this was the maintenance that happened quietly on Saturday mornings before anyone else was up. She'd have the stoop done before you came down for breakfast. You might not have known she did it at all, except the ants were never a problem, and now that she's gone, they are. 3 in the morning, the kind of toothache that makes the whole side of your face feel wrong, and she was already awake. She'd been awake for hours. She went to the pot, brewed a cup of tea strong enough to make your eyes water, and when it had cooled just enough, she pressed a warm, damp tea bag against the aching gum and held it there. Tannic acid has a mild anesthetic effect on inflamed tissue, constricting blood vessels and temporarily numbing the surface of the gum. This came from the women who came before her, the ones who had no dentist to call, no pharmacy on the corner, no option but to know what worked from what was on hand. She sat with you in the dark. She held the tea bag in place when your hand got tired. She talked quietly about nothing until the pain dialed back enough for you to sleep. You cannot call her at 3 in the morning anymore. That particular remedy is gone. The coffee pot never came off the stove. That was the first thing you noticed about her kitchen, the thing that marked it as hers, the old percolator, or the aluminum drip pot set on the back burner at the lowest flame, always warm, always ready, never empty for long. She made the first pot before 5, and the last pot wasn't made so much as maintained. The old grounds refreshed with new ones added on top, the liquid darkening through the afternoon into something stronger than what most people would call coffee. You didn't pour the last cup from that pot. There was an unspoken rule about the last cup. It stayed in the pot, a small reserve, because an empty pot meant a cold kitchen, and a cold kitchen meant something had stopped. Company came and went. The pot stayed on. Children grew up and moved north and came back for holidays. The pot stayed on. She got older and slower and eventually stopped standing at that stove. The first morning after she passed, someone went in and turned off the burner. That was the moment the kitchen understood what had happened. Diluted weak tea in baby's bathwater was the remedy for heat rash and the raw fold irritation that summer brought to infant skin. She'd brew it very weak, 1 bag to a full pot, steeped only until the water turned pale amber, and added to the bathwater while still warm. The tannins in diluted black tea have mild anti-inflammatory and astringent properties that calm irritated skin without the compounds in commercial preparations. She knew the right color the water should be, not dark, not clear, just barely tinted, and how long to leave the baby in it. You couldn't learn that from a book. You learned it by being in that bathroom, watching her hands, listening to how she talked to the baby while she worked. That knowledge passed person to person, and when the person was gone, it stopped passing. Cold coffee poured over the sweet potatoes before they went into the oven. Not much, just enough to pool in the bottom of the pan, was the difference between a sweet potato that was good and one that stopped the conversation when it came to the table. The coffee's acidity caramelized the natural sugars in the skin faster and deeper than dry roasting alone, producing a crust that was almost lacquered and an interior where the faint bitterness of the coffee made the sweetness of the flesh taste more pronounced by contrast. Sweet potatoes were a constant in African American kitchens from the earliest decades through the 1970s, grown in home gardens, bought cheap at roadside stands, stored through winter, and the women who cooked them most often developed the most exacting methods. She roasted them this way for decades. You watched her pour the coffee into the pan every time. It never occurred to you to ask why until she was no longer there to answer. She never poured herself the first cup. That was the rule, and you only understood it as a rule after you'd watched it happen enough times to see the pattern. The pot finished, the cups brought down, the first cup poured for whoever else was in the kitchen, and her own cup filled last from whatever was left. By the end of the day, what was left was the last cup, thicker than what the morning had been, stronger, the flavor of everything that had been extracted and re-extracted through hours of low heat. She drank it standing at the stove, not sitting, not settled, just standing, looking out at whatever the window gave her. Nobody talked about it. It was not a sacrifice anybody named. It was just the way the kitchen ran, the same way every good thing in those kitchens ran. From her hands outward, from her cup inward, from her patience forward, into everything you ate and everyone you became. The pot is empty now. You know where the coffee is. You know how to make it. You will pour yourself the first cup, and you will think of her, and you will understand for the first time what the last cup meant. For families across the rural South from the 1930s through the 70s, Fatback was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Every pot of greens, every skillet of cornbread, every pot of beans started with a piece dropped in to render. The American Heart Association spent decades warning against saturated fats, and Fatback sat at the top of their list. But it is also rich in vitamin D and oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat praised in avocados. Salt cured and stored in a cool cellar, it lasted months without refrigeration, essential where electricity was unreliable and grocery stores were miles of dirt road away. She sliced it, thin for seasoning, thick for frying, and never let the supply drop below what February required. Before the Crisco campaigns of the early 1900s convinced America that vegetable shortening was cleaner and more modern than animal fat, every black kitchen in the South kept lard within arm's reach. It went into biscuits, greased the cornbread pan, seasoned the greens, and fried the fish on Friday. When public health campaigns hit full speed in the 1960s, they painted lard as poison, the cause of heart disease and early death. What they never said was that lard is roughly 45% monounsaturated. Fat, the same heart-friendly fat in olive oil. It has less saturated fat than butter and none of the trans fats that riddled hydrogenated vegetable shortenings. It carries fat-soluble vitamins D and E and holds up under deep frying heat without breaking down into harmful compounds. Every biscuit she pulled from that oven, golden and flaky from rendered pork fat, was better for you than anything made with the processed alternatives that replaced it. Poke salad greens were a springtime tradition in African American households across the rural South, gathered wild from fields when fresh vegetables were scarce. Health officials warned against eating pokeweed for decades, calling it toxic. And they were partly right. Raw pokeweed contains compounds that cause illness. But black families already knew that, which is why the greens were always boiled in multiple changes of water before being sauteed with onions and fatback. This process removed the harmful toxins while preserving impressive nutrition. Scientists now confirm that properly prepared poke salad is rich in vitamins A and C, iron, and antioxidants that rival cultivated greens. The knowledge of safe preparation was passed through generations of women who understood botany through practice. Whole raw milk was a staple in rural black households through the 1950s, drawn from family cows or shared between neighbors who kept dairy goats across the Deep South. The FDA banned the interstate sale of raw milk in 1987, calling it dangerous, but studies published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology found that children raised on raw milk had significantly lower rates of asthma and allergies. The milk contained natural lactase-producing bacteria that aided digestion. The same grandmothers labeled lactose intolerant by doctors had been drinking milk just fine for years. She skimmed the cream for butter, let the rest clabber for baking, and wasted nothing. When the cow was gone, the milk changed, and so did the mornings. It came in tins so heavy a child needed both hands to carry one, and it sat on the shelf like medicine because that is exactly what it was. The bowl went on the counter before bed. Dried pintos covered in cold water, left to sit through the night, swelling slowly in the dark. By morning, the beans had doubled, and the water had turned cloudy with everything the soak pulled out. Quick soak methods and canned beans promised the same result without the wait. But that overnight soak was breaking down phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that binds to iron, zinc, and calcium and blocks the body from absorbing them. Studies show that soaking legumes 12 hours reduces phytic acid up to 70%, dramatically improving mineral absorption. The soak also breaks down oligosaccharides, complex sugars responsible for gas and bloating. She did not call it anti-nutrient reduction. She called it putting the beans on. And she poured off that cloudy water in the morning without a second thought because her mother had done it and her mother before that, and nobody ever asked why. Chitlins, slow boiled with vinegar, were long considered one of the most controversial dishes in African American cuisine, ridiculed by outsiders and warned against by food safety officials. The dish required hours of meticulous cleaning and boiling, a process many authorities dismissed as risky. But families understood something science recently confirmed. Slow boiling with vinegar created an acidic environment that destroyed harmful bacteria while tenderizing the meat into something rich and flavorful. The vinegar acted as both a natural disinfectant and flavor enhancer, cutting through the heaviness of the pork. Modern food scientists now acknowledge this method of acidic slow cooking was effective food safety long before refrigeration existed. The women who stood over those pots were practicing microbiology without the title. Sorghum, a West African grain brought to the Americas through the slave trade, was pressed into syrup at small community mills, many Black-owned, and poured into mason jars that lined pantry shelves from harvest through spring. Food historian Michael Twitty documented sorghum as one of the most culturally significant crops in the African American agricultural tradition, tracing it to grain syrups made in West Africa for centuries. Nutritional analysis shows sorghum syrup has a lower glycemic index than refined sugar and contains iron and B vitamins. She drizzled it over cornbread, stirred it into hot water for a morning tonic, and baked it into cakes darker and richer than anything white sugar could produce. When the last Black-owned mills closed in the 1980s, the jars stopped appearing, and a sweetness left the kitchen that no store-bought bottle could replace. The jar sat on the counter in plain sight, and if you did not grow up with it, you did not understand it. The pot sat on the back of the stove from before church until well after the last plate was scraped clean. Nobody rushed it. It just simmered, low, steady, all day, while the kitchen filled with the smell so thick you could taste it before you lifted the lid. Modern cooking culture called this inefficient. Quick cook methods promise the same result in minutes, but collagen in bone-in meats converts to gelatin at around 160 degrees, and that transformation depends on both temperature and duration. The longer the simmer, the richer the yield of glycine, proline, and dissolved minerals drawn from cartilage and marrow. Those Sunday pots of stewed meat, neck bones settling into gravy, beans thickening against smoked pork, they were extracting nutrients no 30-minute shortcut can replicate. She knew the pot was ready by the way the house smelled. That was chemistry she learned standing next to her own mother, watching the lid rattle just enough to know the heat was right. Sassafras, tea, and filet powder were staples in African American kitchens, especially in Creole communities where ground sassafras leaves thickened the gumbo and brewed root bark made a fragrant tea. In the 1960s, the FDA banned sassafras oil after studies linked saffron to liver damage in rats. The ban criminalized a tradition that had nourished families for centuries, but modern researchers revisited those findings and noted the doses given to rats were astronomically higher than normal cooking use. The sassafras leaves in filet powder contain almost no saffron, and homemade tea was far too diluted to pose real risk. Scientists now recognize sassafras also contains anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial compounds supporting immune health. What was banned turned out to be beneficial. These kitchens held an entire world. If your grandmother knew any of these, leave her name below.